This is Tino Sehgal, who's not visiting Moscow for the first time, I think, but quite enjoying it here. And Francesco Bonami, who also is quite open to Russian culture. And some of his books has been translated by VAC Foundation into Russian. I somehow need to start this talk, so I think it will be quite relevant to start it with talking about 100th anniversary of revolution. And there's been like a lot of shows about Russian Revolution and about documenting it and about how artists are responding to it today and how they've been responding to it throughout the 20th century. But then there is another revolution that happened the same year, and it was Marcel Duchamp who exhibited his work Fountain at the Society of Independent Artists in New York. And that happened the same year, and I think that was quite a revolution also on the same level, and something that we will probably remember and that will be affecting us for a bit longer than the one that happened in Russia. And something that is also relevant to this event is Francesco Bonami's book that came out quite recently, which is called From Urinal to Oral.
It's not a real title, but there was a real title at the beginning.
Okay, so that was an original title, but it's something also that explains the period that you're talking about, which is from 1917.
From the urinal of Duchamp to Tino Sehgal.
To Tino Sehgal. So I was just curious how you would both define what happened until today, until this moment here with art, and how artists were explaining us what they're working with, because it was such an extensive period that happened, and that was using the language of Duchamp, so using the object to describe something that is not related to it. I think if you can talk maybe a bit about your book a little bit and explain this period, maybe, and then we can.
No, I think that is my book started from 1917 and 2017, but mostly ends in the Tino Sehgal works, which I think, in my simple opinion, it's both the end of a revolution and the beginning of a new revolution. The object totally, completely disappear in Tino Sehgal work, but at the same time it starts a new idea of telling stories or allowing us to imagine other possibility about art. And I think that if you go to the Architecture Museum today, in the show, there is the Kiss Simplified, which is, I think, is really a work that explains the entire thing, because it's a work that you don't see, basically, at the beginning. You don't see nothing. I thought it was a wall. And then you start to see slowly, you start to see these two figures, naked, kissing, and it brings back to your mind the entire history of visual arts, basically. It comes from the kissing people in Pompeii, to Francis Bacon, to everything. It's open up your imagination because you cannot see very well. And also, it's, I believe it is a very strong visual work of art, because it's like a painting in a museum with, these two naked people, but you cannot touch them. you know that you cannot touch them. Nobody tells you, but you know that you cannot touch those two naked people, you know, and maybe you are tempted, you know. And so I think it's really like a painting, that you can, you know when you go in a museum that you cannot touch the object of art that is there. And I think that's both classical and revolutionary. So Tino opened up a new, completely a can of worm, in a way, for art, because from now on it's very hard to understand what's going to happen, you know, because you cannot, also I think that Tino Sehgal is kind of work that you cannot, I did even a show that I say I'm not Tino Sehgal, but you realize that it's not a work that you can forge, you know. You cannot do a fake Tino Sehgal, you can only copy Tino Sehgal, you know. You can do something that looks like Tino Sehgal, but you cannot forge it. You cannot do a fake Tino Sehgal. It's almost impossible. So I think also this is interesting. He's so immaterial, but he's so material. He also abides to all the laws of art that we know, the kind of classic.
So most of the things that that happened until what Tino did, they were out of some kind of material. So from 1917, what do you think like really describes the period for you, and how were you explaining it to yourself to, you know, think in a way to make a constructed situation?
I mean, first of all, when you talk about revolution, it's a word that in general I stay away from, and I'm kind of uncomfortable with. And while you both were saying these nice words, I feel very honored by, and also very happy to be here and to be able to be here in this big museum in this big country. I was thinking, why am I uncomfortable with this word revolution? And I think what revolution sounds a bit like everything is new, you know, a cut. That's a very modern way of thinking, like, but it's also a very juvenile way of thinking, that it's somehow possible, or naive way of thinking, that's somehow possible to say like, okay, everything which was before is over and now something new comes. I think the way life works, rather, is that something new enters and it connects in a very specific way to something old. This is an argument of Boris Greuze, and he also makes it with Duchamp. Like, in a way, Boris Greuze says that, like, if you want to make art, since, let's say, Duchamp, since 2017, you have to do something which has an aspect of new, but which also which relates to something which was before. Yeah? So this idea of the revolution, of the completely new, of the completely different, doesn't exist. Yeah? And Greuze makes this kind of, takes as his example exactly Duchamp's urinal fountain, and he says that it's very important in this work, actually, the photograph of Stieglitz, which makes it look like this Buddha figure and gives it this kind of aesthetic aura, which it totally didn't have for people at the time. I mean, like, now we're sitting here 100 years later talking about it as some kind of icon of Western, modern, creative practice or something. But at the time, I'm sure people just, I mean, they were either shocked or they didn't care, really, you know? Like, it wasn't such a, it needed to be, you know, Duchamp needed to make this little magazine, The Blind Man, let Stieglitz photograph it, you know, in this kind of Buddha-like way and oratic way, to connect it to something older. So, for me, the idea of the revolution, I think what exists are cultural processes, and they are kind of function more like with a difference in repetition, like Derrida or Butler say, you know, and it's like kind of this kind of like a slow maelstrom or a slow glacier which is going. There's no real way to stop it, and there's no real way to accelerate it. So, of course, maybe there can be something like quantum leaps, you know, but nothing comes out of nowhere, and nothing also changes so quickly, so radically.
But also, what Greuze was saying is that in every period we kind of want to have control over the knowledge, over theories that we're having, and also this is something that we see in art, like the control part of performing the knowledge. I'm just wondering if this is what is happening today as well, or was it the surrealists trying to perform their knowledge of their theories, and then constructivists showing their control over industry and that society that was happening?
Go.
I mean, again, like, I don't know this theory, what you're saying about like controlling the knowledge or something, but I totally don't believe it. You know, like I don't think it's possible, and it's possible less even today. It's possible maybe in a small village. It's possible with radio and television, you know, like it was done in the totalitarian systems, both in the East and the West, to a certain degree, but never for too long. I mean, this is the experience we had also in East Germany that you had here. You can never control the knowledge for too long. And nowadays, I think with the internet, absolutely impossible. You know, and with 7 billion, almost 8 billion people now on this planet, I don't think it's really, I mean, maybe people can do it to a certain degree, but never to a very relevant degree, I think, and never for too long.
It's just the idea of having another revolution in the language of art is changing from what happened before into what's going to happen after. And I know you don't really like talking about revolution like a one exact transitional point. But if we think that maybe there's something that happened in 2017, how would you describe what is going to happen afterwards? Because we need to develop whatever we have already, and not only with the materials, but also with the new language that we're creating in art.
Well, I agree when you say that the revolution really doesn't happen as we see. It's like you talk about the photograph of the urinal by Stiglitz. He was giving a aura around this object. Is a revolution like those kind of soup that you do them, but they're better the day after, you know? You have to leave them on, you know, and that's how our revolutions. I think after when you think about them, they're always better, you know, they look always much better than what happened. It's like the urinal. People that saw it probably find it absolutely mundane and absolutely annoying, but then the photograph of Stiglitz, it's something that changed completely the aura around that. And this, maybe, I know you don't want to talk about your work, but I think that it's interesting that you don't want picture of your work, probably maybe thinking about what a picture can do to something. It can transform completely. It can warp your memory, and instead, you know, if you don't have a picture, you rely only to your memory, and your memory produce maybe also a kind of revolution that doesn't exist really in reality. But if you have a picture, and particularly today, you can have tons of different ways to create something, you know, around what you see that is not exactly what you see. So it's a paradox that we have so many images, so many information, so we know everything, but at the end, everything we know is manipulated and is not related to our real memory. So I think that's why probably the fact that, I don't know if that's the reason why you don't want the pictures, you know, but probably it's not, but maybe that's a thing, that you allow your memory to remember, you know, for example, again, the work that I was talking before, I have just to remember, you know, also that was interesting because in that space you cannot even sneak a picture. It's very, you know, everybody sees you. It's like peeing in a swimming pool, you know, when, you know, when you are by yourself, they see you.
Is this the reason for no photographs?
You know? What?
Is this the reason for no photographs?
No, it's not the reason, but Francesco's reasons is better than my reasons. So I'm going to just stick with his reason. That's why you brought him here.
I don't know. It's just that I think, you know.
I'm going to steal it from you.
Yeah.
So you've created this practice based on certain rules. And Francesco made a show that was called I'm Not Tino Sehgal, to sort of
I don't know. I do shows.
have a conversation,
Yeah.
conversation about his work through
To other people,
people's
how
work.
people was looking at his work, and how people, you know, as I say, can copy or try to do something inspired to that, or it's how you can maintain both authenticity and fakery around the work that is, you know, is intangible in a way. So that was the idea for the thing.
Do you see the development of your practice in any certain way?
I mean, if I understood you correctly, I wanted to come back what you were saying earlier. If I understood you properly, is like what's going to come now was a little bit the question, no? And I think, obviously, like Francesco said, obviously we don't know, but you know, I don't think there's anything illegal about like speculating on a what are we today, Tuesday afternoon, you know? And so I think what's interesting to me personally at the moment is this idea that like, well, what I'm interested in, that somehow everything that humans do is kind of, you can be described as a game, you know? So in that sense, also art is a game which starts at a certain point. I mean, creativity exists since the beginning of human times, and painting exists since also almost the beginning of human times. But what we call art, you know, like where, you know, it has an author, who is an individual, you give it a title, you give it a date, you know, that's a notion which is maybe 300 years old, and it's a certain game which made sense in a certain period, you know? And to me, this game is very much based around the idea of individualism. It's very much based on the idea of liberalism. You can it's a flexible format here. You come and go when you want. You can talk, be social, or not. You can focus on a work for like 3 hours or 1 second, or not even look at it, you know? And so it's related to a certain kind of era, which is obviously the era of production, you know? So it's for me not a coincidence that like in the 19th and 20th century, which both here in this part of the world as well as in the more western parts of the world was a let's say the industrial age, which had the idea that like the good life can come from, or stability can come from, you know, taking the earth's resources and transforming them through machines which were powered by coal energy into many, many products or goods. And if we kind of put more products we produce, the happier we are going to be, you know? And that's a certain game that humans played, but it's a new game. I mean, the history of humankind, I don't know, is like, I don't know how many years do humans exist on Earth. I don't know. How, does anybody know? How many? I don't know. Like how many?
6 million.
Huh?
6 million.
6 million? Is that true? Yeah. No. How many?
Let's say a long time.
10,000 years? Yeah.
No, it's not true. There are millions of years before. They found skulls.
Yeah. Okay, we can discuss that at the bar, yeah, or somebody can get out their phone and like Google it for a moment and then raise their hand or shout it out. But anyway, like humans have existed for something between 10,000, yeah. 50,000 according to, this is like an auction, 50,000, 300,000.
Sold.
300,000 here.
Let's go for the compromise. It's democracy. Yeah? That's what Plato didn't like about democracy. Yeah. You go for the compromise. Okay, 50,000 years for today. Yeah.
Okay.
So 50,000 years. What I'm trying to say is that, like, in these 15,000 years, we're playing this game called art for like 200-300 years. So if you can get out your calculator, you can say you can tell me how much percent that is. Yeah. How much percent of 200 years or 50,000 years. So anyway, whatever it's going to be, it's a very, very small percentage. And so humans play certain games. You can also say the game of a fixed cosmology, otherwise known as religion, is also a game which was played for many, 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 many centuries. Yeah, wasn't always played, but also you could say monotheistic religions is a particular game which was maybe played for 2 centuries really strongly. Yeah, 2,000 years very strongly. Sorry. And so what's interesting to me, if you say what's going to come, also something that like Carol and Christoph Bakakiev would sometimes allude to a little bit, is this game of art going to continue? That's, I think, we suppose that it was there for all times and will continue for all times. But these kind of places like museums, most of them are national galleries. They were founded like between 200 and 300 years ago. Before, these kind of places didn't exist. And why should they continue to exist for, a few hundred years? And like if we see what you guys are doing here at the former power station with building your new institution, it's very interesting that you don't want to define it as a museum. I don't know why. Maybe Teresa, you have to speak about that also. But like somehow, like I haven't figured it out in the last day, you don't want to call it a museum and you don't see it as a place of objects necessarily. Each time I make a gesture, it goes chick, 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 chick. Now it stopped working. Okay, so it's interesting that like already in this city with these people who are organizing also this event, like somehow they're exiting this idea of the museum, and in my opinion exiting the idea of the museum to a small degree. Of course it's mainly a museum, looks like a museum, has a museum architect, Renzo Piano, and it's probably mainly going to show object art, exhibition art, but you're also going to show concerts, live events, screenings, other formats. Same like the Shed, the new institution which is being built in New York at the same time. So that's something that I'm interested in, is this notion of art going to stay? At the same time, if you look at something like Instagram or something, it's a very visual place with a very high distribution, access at all times. People are extremely visually literate nowadays. There are new canons being built also, or maybe no canons, or canons being dissolved maybe more, like the canon of like 20th century art. I mean, I know a lot of people in their 20s who are very visually literate, but for them doesn't necessarily play a role, like Daniel Boren, who is that, And that was obviously not the case, 10, 15 years ago. Even Marcel Duchamp is there. I don't know. It's a certain canon also. That's a certain game. This canon of like Western art is also a certain game. And when people are stop being interested in playing it, it also in a way stops to exist, no?
So it sounds like the museum was something from the past, and that period was sort of described by an object. I'm just asking this question because of some research I'm doing for how to describe the next institution to have.
Well, it's different. And a new institution is different. I think museum is like is a word like theater or movie theater or television or iPhone. It's a place where things happen inside, and that the things that happen inside that change our perception of things. Before, as you say, before the museum, there were the churches or there were the palace of the people. Those were the museums. Now those palaces became museums. So I think it's a transformation. Not only just of the word, it's of the experience that you have inside these spaces. And I think the experience in front of what we call art, that is 3,000 years, so 5%, if you want, about the existence of human life, It's about the experience, how you experience what happened in places. Then places, you can call them how you want, a gallery, museum, theater, churches, palaces or something, but I think is irrelevant in the name that you give to a place. What is relevant is the experience that you will have in a place.
Yeah, but I think that in this tradition of, let's say, also people like Daniel Boren, which is my tradition, like, I think, yes, like, through what I do in this place, and I think I probably managed to do that to a certain degree, through what you do in the places like this one, you can change the experience of the place. But of course, the place itself makes a very strong impact on the experience. You know, the fact, like I was saying earlier, that you can come at any time you want, that you walk through here as an individual is a very different experience than going to the Bolshoi, sitting down with like a few hundred people. You can't leave, you become like a collective body. Here you're trained to become like an individual. You know, like something that I'm very obsessed by is also the kind of beginning of museums where, for example, the National Gallery in London, it was built between the East End and the West End. So, and one of the ideas of the gallery has nothing to do with art. I mean, the beginning of museums is like done by social reformers, and they wanted to create spaces, public spaces, where people of lower classes could observe people of higher classes to civilize. There's this beautiful book by Carol Duncan called Civilizing Rituals, which is a book about museums. So. And I belong, or I adhere more to this tradition of museum studies coming out of sociology, more than like art history. You know, so for me, these places are more places which are about shaping behavior of citizens, rather than, let's say, just empty containers. Like this idea that they are like containers for certain content. That to me is like the idea of art history, but art history again is just a game, like sociology or museum studies is also just a game and is a certain kind of perspective. Each game has its relevance. Nonetheless, I think that my personal opinion is that like this idea of museum studies, that these are places of ritual places of democratic
conviviality.
Yeah, but also very unconvivial conviviality for nations. Yeah. So because, you know, if you compare a museum to a Italian piazza on some kind of, you know, little village, there's a real conviviality.
Yes.
Here there's the conviviality which is related to much bigger societies which are in the millions. The Italian village is like in the hundreds. So yeah, you can go up to your like neighbor or your friend that you know from school, you give him a kiss, you go walk up down the piazza, you talk. Here there's too many people. You can't know everybody, you don't want to know everybody, but you can check out their behavior. And that was one of the ideas, like I said, one of the ideas that like people of lower classes would civilize themselves, but how can they learn how to be civilized if they never meet somebody of the more civilized classes, you know? So this was a place of bringing them together. And sometimes if you look in a museum, I suggest that to you, it's often also the doorways really frame people. It's very, they create a distance between people which is close enough to check them out, but far enough that you can look at them without being like weird.
But that, to me, that sounds like something that has changed a lot, because what you're describing, that the museum was made for lower classes, so it had a really didactic purpose, that space. Right now we are trying to move away a little bit from education in a very strict way. So we're more looking for people contributing to the space that has arts.
Well, I don't think that people can contribute to the arts. I mean, I think that people, I don't think they want to contribute to the art. I think most of the people want to go in places where...
It's more like participate in and take the risk of being in this progress, or take a risk of going and experiencing a concert.
Open up, I think, in this experience in front of the like, I am progress. This is progress. It's you go and you allow yourself to have this experience. I think it's all about experiencing something, you know. And this is, I think Tino does it in a certain way, but other former theater have done in other ways, you know, the breaking up the rules and the frame and the symbolic space of the theater or something. That I think is the way that people get attracted by. But there are people that don't want to this is progress, you know. They get terrified by someone asking you something because they don't understand, you know. It's like...
that's fine, because it's a liberal space where you can choose.
That's a liberal space. So they feel, that's why sometimes people feel much more comfortable in front of a painting or a sculpture, because nobody is really asking them anything. They can look at it and they can decide what they want, but this is progress. It's a challenging work. You have to really be prepared to go into that experience, which is fantastic, but it also can be very intimidating for a normal person. So I think
it's fine when it's challenging, but still, I know that you see art as something that should be accessible to everyone.
I think not diminishing the experience, not putting down the people, you know, not simplifying. That's a problem sometimes. In the American Museum, for example, they simplify the extended label to a point that is for idiots, you know. It's basically, it says exactly what you see in front of you. It doesn't give any explanation. It's a painting with a brick and a cow with a blue sky made in 2015 by the artist when he was in front of a brick, a cow, and a blue sky. So obviously you feel like an idiot if you are intelligent. If you are not intelligent, it's irrelevant what you read. You know, so I think that's a problem. You cannot simplify. You can make it accessible, but you cannot simplify to the point. And that's a big misunderstanding in those art spaces or something, that people tend to make it not accessible, but just simplifying to a point that is stupid. And I think that's with Tino there is not this problem, because you get either confused, either you run away, or you think you're surrounded by crazy people, but then you become, as long as they don't touch you, you know. I don't think any of your work touch other people, no?
Now, there's a moment in this one work which we're also going to show in the Museum of Architecture in 3 weeks. So we have two works in the dark, and after 3 weeks we exchange the works. So I hope you can maybe make it to that work. And there's actually a moment, doesn't come all the time, but if there's like a good vibe in the room, then there's a moment where there's a moment of touch, yeah. But it's again choice-based, you know. Like one way I'd like to describe sometimes our society is also selection society, you know. Like I'm from Germany, and German sociology likes to call society with some kind of noun before it, like risk society, experience society, tiredness society was the last one, and I sometimes say like we're in a selection society. Like anything nowadays is up for selection, you know, where in feudal society it was more like nothing was up for a choice, nothing was to be selected, like even your partner would be selected for you, your job would be selected for you. Now everything is up for selection, you know, like if you want to get a divorce, no problem, we organize a party for you, no? Yeah. And and nobody has a problem with it, you know. So, and in this choice society, if you think it's now good or bad, but nonetheless, the museum is the ritual format, I would say, which is most closely to this kind of choice-based society. And I play this game, like you said. Also, I'm very, you know, touched and honored by your words, what you said about my work at the beginning, like that I kind of also really play by all the rules. And even if I don't always think myself that these rules are the best rules, but I want to play the game, you know, especially as I'm coming in a little bit from left field. And one of the games is that it's a liberal place, and liberal means choice-based. You know, I can choose. I'm free to choose. So we don't worry if you can make it in. When will it come? But who knows when it comes? It starts. When do you know?
22nd. Yeah,
23rd of August. I think that the works change. So if you can make it, yeah, don't worry. They're not gonna. Most probably it's not gonna happen, because it only happens when there's really a nice atmosphere. And then they won't force you to do anything. But they might touch you if you want. Yeah.
But you are very, in a way, classical, because one thing that always interests me in art history is the moment when the painter, I think good painters, stop signing their painting. I think that the last painter that signed, and you are the first artist that signed again the work in the front, because at the end of your works, you say you sign the work. Philip Gaston, I think, was the last painter that respected artist that signed the work in the front.
Yeah.
I don't know why that they don't sign it anymore, but I didn't study the
No, I think
the
it's a
process.
very interesting
But
observation.
that he signed the work again. So
No, it's more complicated than that. But I really like your observation, and I hope we can talk about this for a minute. I hope it's also interesting to you guys here in front of me. But I just showed my work in Basel together with I used the works of Matisse as a kind of fresco, and I had the same. And it was from 1952, and I was like, such a nice paper cut Matisse, but why is he ruining the work by signing on the front, you know? And so I had the same, but I didn't think about it so long, like that Philip Gaston or maybe Matisse are the last artists who sign on the front and are still respected. And then in the course of my own work, I never really thought, I mean, first I was young, so I needed to play by the rules a little bit, but at the same time not play by the rules, which is this classic definition of art in a way. Like you have to be art, and that's very Western, you have to kind of not be art to be art. You know, like I think that's why I also had very quick reception of my work. I think 2 years after I started doing work, I was already representing Germany at the Venice Biennale. Or no, 2 years after I started doing work, I was at the Venice Biennale with you. And 4 years later, I was at the German Pavilion. And so, wait, now I sidetracked myself with this tangent. I wanted to talk about something.
Signature.
Yeah, the signature. So in terms of my work, like I had to play by the rules by at the same time not playing by them at all. And then later I made the whole process. Like I stopped signing my work actually. Yeah, so it's I got more and more uncomfortable with it, like people saying my name and like so. And for example, the work at the Venice Biennale in 2013 with Massimiliano Gioni curated. Yeah, actually it was kind of, I wasn't happy with that either. I didn't find a good solution, but like there was no way you could find out who the work is by. So there's like these two people, we're not showing this work here, but there's like 2 or 3 people kneeling on the floor. One is singing and the other has the eyes open, the other one is dancing, kind of but kneeling on the floor and has the eyes closed. And that's it, you know, and there was no label, no flyer, and it was like in the central pavilion. Sometimes I thought, this is also too extreme, Tino, like they really cannot figure out what it is. But Massimiliano never really said anything to me, so it was like, but so I did the same process. Like now I haven't really signed the works. And I haven't really found a good solution because I don't like when they say, this is a work by Tino Sehgal. Like this feels a little bit crude to me nowadays.
Are you getting rid of anything material then in your work?
No, that I think I took care of, but I don't like this kind of anymore. I don't like them to say this is a work by Tino Sehgal or something. I did that for like maybe, I did it less and less. For example, in this variation, this work which we're going to show from the 23rd of August, the dancers can choose if they say my name or not. But they still sometimes say the title, but the title is actually a form of communication. So for example, if they say this, they mostly sing it like this variation 2012, then that actually means something in this game. So it's like a kind of communication tool. So it means like, okay, let's work on this spacing or something, you know, like how we are distributed in the room. But it's also somehow the title of the work. And I said to them like, yeah, you can say Tino Sehgal, this variation, or you can just say this variation. They never said my name again. And that was also fine, you know, like, and then after that, I don't think I really brought in the title anymore.
So
Which was the first work of Mr. Sehgal that you saw in your life?
No, that was this progress actually.
Oh.
Yeah, and there you don't have any signatures?
No, the child says this is a work by Tino Sehgal. So it's not really a label, but they do explain it. This is a work by Tino Sehgal. Would you like to follow me? And then at the end, I mean, you can see it here at the Museum of Architecture. At the end, the last person that you meet, they say the title, my name is so-and-so, and the title of this work. So it comes kind of inside the work. But yeah.
That was the first one that I saw, and I think like talking about getting rid of anything that is attached to an art object, how you are taking out everything from an art object. Good point of to ask the question that we wanted to ask, maybe.
No, I have two questions that I want to ask. Once, I don't remember when, we were standing somewhere and just chatting, and we were talking about other younger artists, and you told me that you're very interested in ambition.
Yeah. Interested in ambition. Yeah, I was young then. I mean, there's an amazing quote by Duchamp, and maybe we can put it on the website, Teresa, but because I'm not going to be able to really quote it, but he says, you know, he calls it the age of ambition. He says, Duchamp says, it exists in every field, exists in business, exists in art. He said, the artist will do anything to end up in the Metropolitan or the Louvre. It's called the age of ambition. You have it in business too, but it passes, you know. So I somehow slowly passed. And the passing, I hope, you know, because I think, yeah, it's a thing of maturity when you relax. But yeah, when you're a younger person, you want to kind of find your place in the world, especially as a man. I think as a male person, you have to define yourself through what you do, you know, because you can't define yourself through the child that you bear. And these are very archaic things, and nowadays they're not so popular to talk about it, but I think they're still at work. And I think I am an ambitious person. I think, you know, I put my ambition in my work somehow, but I think not only, I hope. So I'm sorry that I said that today. I feel embarrassed that I said that. No,
you didn't say it. We were talking about it, and you say why they don't have ambition. I was saying something like that, and you say I'm interested in ambition. And so I was particularly interested.
Oh, that's something that relates to whatever you call the confident 20th century. Is it the ambition that maybe you were talking about?
I think ambition can, I mean, let me try to take a more measured approach. Now I just wanted to kind of like distance myself from my own comment, which I'm slightly embarrassed about. But like, but I think, yes, ambition comes kind of from a more, I don't know, like kind of egoic place. But nonetheless, it can produce something good, you know? Okay. Because it's a direction. Maybe it doesn't come from a good place inside yourself, but it can generate something good at times. And what I said about the 20th century, I think that the 20th century, I think in general, like my metaphor for, I don't have as good and funny metaphors as Francesco, like the soup. I love the soup metaphor. That it's better when you leave it when you leave it for a day, or it's better when you think about it. But one metaphor that, yeah, I don't know if it's a good metaphor, but now after Francesco gave all these good metaphors, I'm kind of thinking a little bit if I should go down this route.
Let me just ask you about the objects related to maybe ambition and do you feel like that is something relevant to Jeff Koons's work?
Yeah. I mean, let me just say it without a metaphor. Like, let me backpedal on the metaphor, but not on what I wanted to say. I think that, like, what I wanted to say is that there's a certain kind of confidence, especially in the avant-garde, where there's this idea that, like, you as an individual, also has something to do with individualism, we're going to come and write our manifesto, like the futurists, or also any kind of avant-garde, very young, and you have to think that the avant-garde artists which are now celebrated, nowadays mostly they were in their 20s, they were young men in their 20s. So young men in their 20s is a certain kind of phase of life, you know? And I don't know, let's say, this kind of young male confidence, you know, if it's really so deep. Let me put it like that. So when I say the confident 20th century, I think the 20th century was a lot about this idea, both in art as well in society, that, you know, with a little idea, with a little life, you know, I mean, like one life, and in contrast to tradition, which like over generation builds up a certain kind of culture. With one life, with one idea, being 25, you know, you can change the world, make a revolution, you know. And this is a certain kind of, for me, a bit juvenile confidence. That's what I was trying to say, and I am not so impressed by it, you know. Like, I don't think I can learn something. Well, I think you can learn something from everything, and you can probably learn something from the avant-gardes, but I don't believe that they have that much to say as much as we celebrate them today. You know?
Do you think that is something that worth of celebration?
To celebrate? No, I don't celebrate many things. I'm not. I always am in the wrong place when I have to celebrate something, or with the wrong people. So that's the story of my life. You know, and every time someone always is mad that they were not there when I celebrate something. So unfortunately, that's a sad story. But I agree with him. I mean, when avant-garde has this kind of self-assurance that can be, what did you say, either annoying or not impressing enough. You know, it's a gesture that maybe, you know, just kind of people get agitated or something, but it's not something that stays. And avant-garde, maybe also that's, I'm interested in what Tina thinks about this idea that I have, that there is art that is about dust and art that is about patina, you know? And that the avant-garde often is about dust, but not in a bad way. They are, you know, in that moment there is this gesture, they are very fresh. But then if you look it backwards, it's dusty, you know? It belongs to a specific period. There are other art that you see it and you keep seeing. I can say Andy Warhol, you could say Jeff Koons, you know? You see it and you see it, even if Jeff Koons can be very dusty sometimes. But I mean, you see it and it's still not, there's no dust. There's this patina of time that is kind of, you don't see it, it's invisible. So my question is, the work of Tino, what will happen? Will it be dusty or will have patina? You know,
we're in a very good place to talk about that. So maybe that can be one of the last questions before we move to the audience. But how does this building and whatever the collection is inside, how was it for you seeing a work by Tino Sehgal, and how was it for you having your show in this context? I don't know who wants to start first.
I mean, first of all, I think I haven't heard this, your distinction between dust and patina, but the way I understand it, I think it's very funny, and I like it. If I understand it correctly, it's somehow between work which is very much of its time, and you think like, yeah, this time is a little bit over, but this is of its time, and work which is a little bit more timeless. Of course, it ages, but it ages well. No, that's the idea, and yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously you want to belong to patina, right? Yeah. But like, can you manage, can you manage? I don't know, like, that's not up to us even, you know, like future generations, if they have an interest in the games that we play here, if they take an interest in these games that we play, because maybe they'll just have interest in the games that they play, that remains to be seen, yeah.
Well, I saw this work here, and I come with this fantasy that will never happen because it's not slavery is not possible anymore. But I was looking at Malevich Black Square, and you see that it's all there's crackled. You know, the painting is a little bit, you know, old. And my dream would be to acquire a work by Tino Sehgal and keep the people in my house and see the work aging. You know. Like the Kiss and see the people aging, you know?
Which is possible.
You know, so possibly surviving until they die. I mean, the work that dies in your apartment. I think it would be very
That's again very funny, but like I have to break it to you. That doesn't work that way. Like either you would have to pay them really a lot of money.
No, that's
so you maybe have to find a kind of patron who helps you on that.
Yeah.
But like I would say my work is algorithmic.
No,
So it's an algorithm, and this algorithm, it doesn't need a particular person, you know?
No, I understand.
Yeah, but it's still a funny idea. But I'm not sure you could convince some dancers to do it in your house. That's also a problem, why my work doesn't really work in these private settings. Because, yeah, it's an expenditure of your soul, of your life's energy, and you need the life's energy and the souls of the others. You know, I don't know how it's for the dancers here, but it's probably something very different when you have people watching. It gives you energy and it gives you a reason to be expending your own kind of, exposing your own kind of interpretation, which puts in your own life's energy, your own soul into this interpretation of the choreography. And if you don't have anybody watching, or always the same guy, as however brilliant he might be, I'm not sure it would really work.
I think that's what's really interesting about the work, that it only works when you're there. And I think that this is also a good way to explain your point about not having a photograph of it, because it only works when you have the feedback from the people who are also the work.
Did you ever change the generation of one of your work? Like, change the age, like one time you do a kiss with 25-year-old people, and one time you do the kiss with 65-year-old people.
Yeah, I mean, but...
Not the, I don't say the kiss, any other work.
I mean, sometimes they can be like, there's works like, some of the works, like there's work up here, this is propaganda with like, we used to install it more strictly, like every woman has to be over 35, minimum age 35, and then I think we started to do most, when I would install it myself like years ago, then I would always try to find like the older the better, you know, like I remember in Eindhoven I had a woman who was like 80, and she would be like kind of just the most purest voice, and then standing there, and but then, for example, I think we started installing this work with this woman singing. We would say like, okay, 6 of them, because it's always different ones doing them. Maybe 6 of them are older, and then 1 is younger in her 20s, you know, just to change it up. And then afterwards, I realized that often the younger ones are also very good, and they have something that, because I can be somehow focused on this more older generation, because to me there's an interesting thing that like when I was younger than I am now, that I'm making an artistic proposal which is executed by somebody who's much older than me. I like that tension. But yeah, I realize also often younger people understand really well, especially the works which are more rule-based or game-based, where like there's a lot of freedom for the interpreter or the player. Then to be honest, I veer to people of my generation, because they kind of have a better intuitive understanding of what I want, you know?
I think we should move to the audience, because I'm sure there is somebody curious about other ages of other interpreters. So if you have questions about that, or about Tino's work, or something not related to Tino, or about Bonami's book, so please.
Я знаю, что вы не ставите свои подписи под различными финансовыми документами. В русском языке есть такое понятие «кидать». Кидать – это когда вы делаете какую-то работу, а вам за нее денег не платят. Вот если вы делаете свой перформанс, так как никаких подписей нет, то тот человек, который заказал вам этот перформанс, может вам просто деньги не отдать. Он просто скажет: я вас кинул, не хочу вам платить деньги за ваш перформанс. Вы в суд подадите на этого человека, будете с ним судиться. Или вы скажете: ну, кинул и кинул, тоже, собственно, перформанс такой со стороны заказчика.
Your question supposes that only a written contract is a legal contract, but actually in life, on this planet, in all countries that I have ever been, most contracts are actually oral. Some contracts are not even oral, but like what one could call behavioral. For example, a behavioral contract would be if you go into a restaurant, you know? The moment that you go into a restaurant and you sit down, You don't even say, I agree that I will pay when you serve me food. Just by the fact of sitting down, without even saying a word, you enter a contract, you know? And so a contract can be oral, and I make oral contracts, you know, and we have witnesses. I mean, it doesn't happen so often, unfortunately, but that I sell a work. But it's a legal thing, and the reason for this whole procedure was that, like, I was interested, you know, in this very kind of material-focused environment of the 20th century that I grew up in. You know, the idea was somehow, this has changed in the last 20 years, I'd say, gradually. The idea was somehow in the 20th century, something only exists if it's material, right? And my work is kind of like the suggestion to say that's actually not so true. You know, like something exists, like this movement, what I'm doing now, exists, you know? And I don't have to make a photo of it for it to exist. And it's this of the same nature as my work, is like a dance or something. And we can have an oral contract, and we can fortify that oral contract via witnesses, and that's legal. In the same way, like if you go to a restaurant and you don't pay, they might decide to file a lawsuit against you, or they probably definitely stop you at the door and say, like, hey, you have to pay. And then it won't help you to say, hey, but I didn't sign any contract, so I don't have to pay. Yeah?
Ну вы в суд подадите, если у вас будет такая ситуация. Вы сами потребуете оплату.
Will you demand to get paid? Will you actually sue them or not?
Потому что ведь, когда вы подойдете в суд, вы должны будете ставить огромное количество подписей. Да? Там без подписи ничего не получится. Вы в суд подадите, если вам не заплатят деньги.
Will you sue them or not?
I honestly, you know, I don't know really where you're coming from. I mean, it seems to be entertaining the audience, but and that's a good thing. I think that entertainment is a really good thing, and you're making people laugh, and that's. I'm not. Sometimes I would like to make people laugh, and sometimes I seem to manage. I mean, Francesco, I think, has more talent than me. Maybe you have more talent than Francesco with your questions. But I don't really know where you're coming from. I mean, I think the market for my work is actually very small, and, you know, I'm focused on doing what I...
Philosophical question for me.
Извините, это серьезная философская проблема. Причем здесь смех?
I think I can tell you something, my dear, you know. I think the whole idea of philosophy went onto a really bad track somewhere in the 19th century, and it's very overrated. So I'm not so excited to talk about philosophy, but I can do that if you like. But I need maybe a few other people to chime in.
How does it usually work with selling your work? And if it's a long process, and do you need anyone to be present at the event of selling?
I mean, it's like I described earlier, like we get together. I mean, the gallery is the one selling the work, the collector is, or the museum is the one buying the work, and then they sit together. Then there's like a number of conditions which come with the sale, like that you have to pay the people who do it, that you cannot show it just for an hour, so it doesn't become a kind of performance, but has to have this temporality of artwork, so it has to be shown during the duration of an exhibition, and a few more conditions like that, and then people shake hands, like they did for many centuries when they did a contract.
For me, it's sort of a smaller version of the notion of like the gift that we have. So can it be like a variation on an anthropological study like that?
No, I don't think like it's a gift, because it's just a sale like any other. And like my work is like a product like any other, and like we live in societies where the service economy is very big, and service economy is the economy of actions as goods, and my work is action as goods. And it's also normal that like that there are now people like me who who do this kind of work, because humans live life, and then in their ritual celebrations they have to reflect on how they live life. So if action as goods is a big part of life, we will have to somehow reflect that part of our life in our ritual celebrations. Like here in the Tretyakov, there's a lot of images of harvesting, for example. But who here in this room has been involved in harvesting? Not many, yeah. Yeah, two. I see two, yeah. So it's who has been in huh? Yeah, I can ask again, or Nicola, you can ask again, who has been involved in harvesting?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, yeah.
There are a lot of people.
Six from maybe 200 or something. It's not as relevant an experience as it was 100 years ago, while the service economy is an experience that most of us share, definitely also as clients. All of us share as clients. So somehow we need to reflect this kind of procedures. That's what humans have always done. Humans, you can also say, is like a ritual being.
А можно дальше аудиторию развлечь? Я хочу еще пару вопросов задать. Можно?
I'd like to entertain the audience a bit more.
Продолжение тех вопросов. Во-первых, у меня такой вопрос. Сколько стоит ваша работа? И можно ли ее приобрести? Мне.
The question is how much a work of yours can be and how you can acquire it.
How much a work of mine can be? I think the most expensive.
Например, поцелуй.
Is like in the higher 5-figure sum. And what was the second part of the question?
How do you acquire?
Can you buy one?
Yeah, I don't know.
There is an addition.
Yeah. But I think we've talked enough about this. I think there might be other questions, no?
Could I ask a question? I'm, as you know, Tino, I was very, very moved by your work when I saw it both yesterday and today, but I'm quite astonished. Museums are sacred spaces, and one of the things that's most special and moving and shocking about this museum is not just the avant-garde, but it's the juxtaposition of the avant-garde with the quote-unquote masterpieces of socialist realism. And it's in the most, if you like, sacred space where Stalinist paintings are being exhibited, which represent everything in their surface and in their implied meaning, that one of your, I believe, very moving works took place, but I can't believe the whole discussion has taken place with a purely avant-garde focus. When you've chosen these very disturbing paintings in which to stage your embrace of young people. No. We talked about how that was also reflected in the harvest sculpture. And there's a lot of eroticism in Stalinist painting. But the environment, which also very explicitly links to terror and assassination in the general's painting, is something in which your work and its context is saying something across time and space that is extremely complex and not to do simply with Marcel Duchamp or the avant-garde. And maybe you could say yourself what that means to you and how you chose that space and how you interpret that piece.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. I think when we were talking about the avant-garde, it came from the question of like the confidence of the 20th century, which is something I once said in 2008 in London, and I was replying to that. I think I totally agree with you. There's much more than the avant-gardes in this museum, and but we started talking about that, and now we can talk about something else. To me, I think what you've said shortly now and longer before is somewhat more interesting than what I can say, and also I really believe in this game, the nature of this game that we call art, and that's kind of like similar to the game of tennis or any kind of game which goes back and forth over the net all the time, like volleyball, or in the sense that like the artist proposed something, the reception does something with it, you know? Like you need both sides somehow. It doesn't, to me, it's too much celebration of the individual, too much focus on the individual. If you say like, the individual makes a proposal, that is the artist, and then the artist also gives the interpretation. No, the whole beauty of this particular game we call art is that the artist makes a proposal, and then in a kind of prism, people make their own interpretations of it, and they can understand something of themselves and of the world through this kind of prism. And so, as much as I personally kind of content with the presentation upstairs, especially in the room that you're talking about, I wouldn't want to kind of narrow it down to one interpretation. But I hope that if you haven't seen it, that you can still see it.
Another question? Yeah. Okay.
Good evening, thanks for coming to Moscow, and a big elevator to VAC funds for bringing you here. I would like to disagree with you about your position of art. You told that it's not that old. I guess that art is as old as a human being, because this action of creation means just breaking the rules. It doesn't mean to have any sense in it. I've got a question to you, Tino. What would you like to say with your art? I mean that, are you trying to educate people, or you're observing human beings watching your art? Like, are you trying to educate someone, to show some ideas? Sorry for this philosophical question. I understand that it bothers you, but...
No, it doesn't. I'm not sure I have a good answer, but first of all, I want to kind of repeat what I said at the beginning. I said the notion of art as we understand it today, you know, is 200-300 years old, in my opinion. And of course, you can disagree with that. But in the same breath, I said sculpture or painting, creativity, dancing, singing, those are activities which are, of course, like you just said, as old as humankind. And it relates to what I said later, that maybe humans are the ritual being. Some people also in neuroscience nowadays say the human beings, what differentiates humans from animals is actually that we are storytelling beings, you know? So maybe the faculty of, let's say, creative expression is, you know, there's some birds which build these nests, I forget their name, but like maybe that's one thing that defines human beings. So I think the disagreement is not as great. I just meant like this, the way we understand art today, I was want to say it's a particular game. That's what I was trying to say. And it has a lot to do with places like these, you know, like art only becomes art through a museum, because if you think of some of the earliest works which exists in museums, they are literally altar pieces taken out of the church, put into the museum. Then they become a work of art, but when they are in the church, they're actually a kind of tool for worship, you know? You can say they're works of art, but that's a little bit retroactive. They were paintings, yes, but were they art in this narrow sense? I mean, this is of course a question of definition, but they weren't works of art in the way we understand them as works of art, like saying like this is Fra Angelico, you know, like people didn't, it was done then. No, it was like a beautiful, like kind of depiction of the Annunciation, which helps me to connect with Maria, you know, and helps me to connect with the divine. Like in India, you know, like they don't necessarily have this idea of art. Like, for example, yantras, you know, these kind of visual kind of ornaments that they do in India, they're not, the idea or even a sculpture of Buddha is not something that you're supposed to really look at. It's something that's supposed to help you meditate on the right attitude, or help you to somehow access some kind of divinity, you know, maybe in yourself, through contemplating or through meditating on this kind of visual pattern or sculpture.
Can your work exist outside the context where you install it?
You mean like museums or something?
Yeah, if you bring out this is progress in outside the.
I mean, depends on the work. To me, it's not so interesting because it also speaks to this context. On the other hand, I have done it, like I did in last year in the Jama Efna, the kind of big square of Marrakesh, where there's a lot of kind of street theater. But there also, it's another game where people kind of come, they gather around you and they stay for a while. So it's not exactly like street theater, because in street theater you have to always generate your own audience and convince people that they should stay. And there it's more, it's easier. People are anyway there to look at different things. And there I showed my work, and people really don't have the notion of art. For example, people were asking my dancers or people around, like, so what is this? And they saw it more as a kind of spiritual practice. And because we were singing a lot, or my dancers were singing a lot, and then we would say, the Westerners would say, yeah, it's art, or it's the artist, and they were like, they literally didn't understand. They said like, oh, you mean the teacher? Yeah, like which in Arabic is the malem or something like that. So say, he's the malem, but artist doesn't really exist there, in that way that we do it, that we think here.
I think there is a question there.
Thank you. I have a question for both of you. Thank you. We talked about art of 1917, and the revolution of art in 1917 was about a form, and subject audience was observing a revolution of form. And what can both of you say of 2020's art? What is the relationships between subject and object, or maybe subject with subject itself? What about these relationships? Thank you. Well, let's say it's how would you? I think it brings us like back a little bit to the beginning of this conversation, but maybe we can repeat how form relates to subject then and compare it to now, and just sum it up a little bit.
I don't have an answer right now. I don't know how it.
Maybe in 50 years.
Maybe in 50 years. I don't know. It's. I will not be here, but I mean, form, object, form, subject. I think is all gets crumbled up, and I think it's not anymore so connected anything anymore. I think it's. We live in a society where content, subject, images. Voices are all mixed up in a big, again, I can go back to the metaphor of the soup, in a big soup, and it's art today is like a soup. You taste the soup, and if you are good, you understand what is in the soup, or you can just eat it and enjoy the flavor without knowing what is inside. So I think that's as much as I can tell you about what I think art is today.
I mean, I'm also not sure I have a good answer to your question, because also it relates to the future, no? And maybe artists nowadays are kind of a form of a priest, but not prophets, you know. So I can't. I said a form of a priest, right? For a kind of global society, but I think, you know, to kind of continue with what Francesco's saying, like when you say subject object, you know, I think that's something which has been really taken apart in philosophy, in Western philosophy, in the last 2 decades in a really big way, you know, from people like Donna Haraway or Bruno Latour, or also so-called speculative realists, which is all a kind of you know, in the tradition of Alfred North Whitehead, so that this kind of Kantian idea of here I am the subject and here's the world, the object, that doesn't really hold true, you know, like it doesn't really, that was a construction done by people like Kant or Hegel, but we are actually much more connected, you know, like we are connected in a vibratory fashion with each other. If I would be sitting here with Francesco and Victoria on my own, saying exactly the same things without you, it would be a very different, I would probably be saying very different things, I would be feeling in a different way. You know, I don't exist as a subject, autonomous entity subject. I'm in a kind of constellation, or one of these contemporary philosophers calls it mesh. You call it soup, but I'm in a mesh with you, you know, or Latour calls it association, you know. So I think one thing, and I think Pierre Huyghe, for example, is the artist which is really working on this idea of the non-subject object dualism, you know, and VAC should bring him to Russia, because I think he hasn't been here, you know, and he's almost making like kind of somewhat didactic exercises in this idea of the mesh. I hope this doesn't get broadcast on the internet.
I don't know. Please. Yes.
Добрый вечер. Меня зовут Милена Орлова, я журналист. Мне кажется, я выражу мнение многих журналистов здесь присутствующих и задам этот вопрос, который многих, ну, ситуация, которая многих здесь, ситуацию, употребляю это слово, которая многих здесь удивила, а меня даже оскорбила. В процессе подготовки к вашей выставке, ну, в частности, мы писали анонс, организаторы вашей выставки запретили очень строго употреблять слово «перформанс» в статьях, которые будут о вашей выставке. Именно этот термин. И использовать исключительно слово «ситуация». Но русский язык достаточно богат, и мы могли бы, как журналисты и художественные критики, использовать те слова, которые считаем нужными для описания этой выставки, тем более, что это не очень понятно как бы многим зрителям, да, и я знаю, что многие люди были этим оскорблены, и мне кажется, что методы, примененные, были несколько тоталитарные. Я являюсь вашей поклонницей очень большой, и меня это, конечно, очень сильно удивило, поскольку вы, ну, человек свободного мира, да, и это было достаточно болезненно. Вот как бы вы прокомментировали это? Вы не доверяете журналистам до такой степени? Да. Спасибо.
I'll translate very briefly.
Yeah, okay. Like, let me answer to that. So I 100% agree with you, and I thank you for bringing this up.
Let's say that the question was about how Tino told us.
But I told you, so that's the misunderstanding.
And we were
now this is coming to group therapy, but like
communicating of not using the word
let me first say I 100% agree with everything that you say, and I also, what is your name? Yeah, Milena, I want to apologize to you personally. I think that's absolutely true what you say. I think that like it's the first time, and I very much, yeah, it's Teresa's fault. She's saying herself, like, what I say is that like I as Tino Sehgal and the institution that invite me, I ask them not to use this word because I think it's, and we could talk about this later at the party, there's 10 reasons why I think the performance is a very almost quasi-colonialistic word, but I don't want to go into that right now. But of course you are 100% right. Like that's a bit, you can't do that. Like you're a free person, you can say whatever you want, you know? We can suggest, and that's not a proper way of operating, and I hope that if we ever work together again that we can kind of remedy that, yeah? So sorry about that.
You should never listen what the artists say.
No.
You know?
The institution can, but not. You can say whatever you want.
No, but the journalists not.
The journalists can say what they want. Yeah.
You can write performance 25 times a day if you want, and you cannot do nothing.
Yeah, and I agree with that exactly. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
Big apology to journalists who were communicated that, but it was. I think so important for VAC Foundation to also present this project in the right way and to have it as Tino Sehgal wants to present his work, but also because it's quite new to this context. And because of the verbal agreement, that's true.
When it was like announced or pronounced, we really tried to follow that because I'm trying. Sorry, excuse me. I'm Zelfira Tugulova, director of the Tretyakov Gallery. I'm very much in favor in my life for verbal agreements versus written signed agreements. And I think that the strongest agreement is a simple gentleman's word. But when we were discussing everything related to the presentation of your work here, and I want to use this opportunity to say how happy we are that this is happening in this building, that all of the emotions and considerations which arise from you, what you had created, add new access or add new interpretation to the works which we exhibit and to which we were so much accustomed. And there is such incredible tension in this gallery with window and big paintings and the kiss on the floor that really I still have these things going through my back and hands when I remember that. So going back, we tried really, it's a very unusual for Russia and new type and kind of art. And we understood that interpretation in this case meant so much that we wanted to follow all of the desires, I wouldn't say requirements, desires, wishes, considerations which you and your colleagues and assistants had expressed. So maybe we went too far. So I'm taking this fault on my shoulders too. But it is because we tried really to do the best. And in Russia, there is a fantastic saying, which is a quotation from the former Prime Minister of Russia, Viktor Chernomyrdin. We wanted to do the best, but it appeared to become as usual. So sometimes we really are too much perfectionist, trying to be following everything which was discussed or was put on the table. So, just a small remark.
Thank you.
Спасибо. Последний вопрос.
It doesn't work. Oh, yes, it does. I'm not sure it's a question. I'm trying to verbalize to see if I understood a couple of connections. Form is something that historically came out of the experience of the ritual. And probably the idea of art, this narrow idea that you mentioned has a few hundred years, it's a consequence of what ritual has created over centuries. In India, in fact, there is still a different approach in certain area, particularly the one that are still related to ritual, to the idea of form. The ephemeral experience of form is something that second avant-garde tried to develop as well. Action painting, conceiving the action of painting more relevant to the painting itself, and so on and so forth. But it was still focusing on the individual artist and on the object, rather than the context. The fact that you're doing this within a museum context or a contemporary art context, in a way, is bringing back this idea of art to ritual. Is that correct? So in a way, you are obviously the creator, but we're not looking at your work when we're looking at two people kissing at each other, but when we are participating to this context and we're part of it as well.
I mean, I think it's very interesting what you say, but like, I'm very interested and curious about what you say, but I see, like I was saying earlier, with people like Tony Bennett or Carol Duncan, these museum studies people, like the museum is definitely a ritual. And it's already obvious in the architecture. Museums are like temple-like places. I mean, they take up the architecture of temples, and you can say it's a cooling. So the difference between, I mean, when we say ritual, we think of like hula hula somewhere on the sand and like, you know, but those are warm rituals which try to bring, like, say, the Dionysiac, warmer energies to what, like through singing. You're a great singer. I found out on Monday. I was very impressed how you were singing. And that's a warming up, you know. And the idea of the museum is a cooling down, you know, like bringing more Apollinian, colder energies into people. There's a very great caricature from the beginning of museums, and it's a two-part caricature, and you see in the one half of it, you see this kind of mob, this kind of drunk mob, which are like, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 people, which are like on top of each other. They're kind of, men are grabbing the women's breast, they're kind of drunk, and they're kind of in a cityscape. You see like a building in the background or something. And then in the next image, you see the same people inside that building, nicely separated into groups of two or alone, looking at the paintings, you know? And that's what it's about. That's what I say, like museum studies, perspective on museums, social reform initiative to create museums in Western nation states is about this kind of cooling down, you know? Like literally in England, the idea was also that Mondays, there was a lot of loss in economic power because people were so drunk from the weekend that they couldn't work on the Mondays. So the idea was to do something they could do together with their wives, which would be a bit more kind of calm and didn't involve drinking, and so that they would still be able to work on the Monday and the whole economy could grow more. No, but just to say, like, it is a ritual. It's just a cooling down ritual, and we associate rituals with warming up. So that's also what the West, I think the West can be described, or like the whole period in the West since the Renaissance can be described in this manner. We try to kind of stabilize what is happening here on this planet. We're less concerned with our connection to other planets or the universe, and because we want to kind of stabilize what's happening here. And I think one of the big successes, you know, like as a father of two children, you know, is the big success, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest success of Western society is that through this kind of focus on what's here, what we could call like the techno-scientific society, you know, a techno-scientific industrial society which emerged here in the West, is like the almost abolition, or like the, not that, well, but like the diminution to a very large degree of child deaths, you know, at birth. I think in other traditional cultures all over the human, I think the death rate at childbirth was like around, I mean, a very high number, like two-figure number, 40%, or I don't know, you have to Google again. But like, and with us it's like, you know, lower than 5%, maybe 2, 1, not even, you know? And so it's about stabilizing processes which happen on Earth, you know, and caring about these processes, maybe caring too much, you know? But that's, so I would say yes, it's always a ritual. It's just a ritual which is a more colder one and therefore less visible to see. But for example, in ritual theory also, one definition of a ritual is also that
you said an artist is like a priest without faith or something like that. So when I'm talking about ritual, I think I'm talking to something similar to what you were describing. Wasn't referring necessarily to the performance of the ritual, but to the context in which the ritual takes place, which is a performance and an audience sharing some rules, a bit like the restaurant you were saying before, no? And reflecting about the performance I saw of yours yesterday, I was thinking that in a way, putting or focusing on the rituality of a work of art, or better, of an art piece within a museum is what is happening when we're assisting to your work. That's why probably in a different context it wouldn't have the same meaning. And indeed, in the past there have been other experiences of ephemeral artworks, but they were not conceived as a contemporary ritual in a way, which the museum are.
I mean,
I don't know if it makes sense.
I think this is a longer conversation, but maybe I can add one more thing, is that like also a privilege that we have nowadays as these kind of so-called artists, you know, and even the idea of the solo show, like these big solo shows that like people like, I don't know, myself or Filippo Reno or, I don't know, Anri Sala, or like there's, you know, who do like a number of solo shows, you know, where when like this is a new format also, which doesn't exist even like Duchamp did his first solo show at like 60, and he didn't conceive of the solo show as one experience or one work, you know. So this also is a new, very new kind of format, you know. And but that's not what I wanted to say. Now I forgot what I wanted to say. I sidetracked myself again. But it will come back. We'll come back in a minute, probably. Maybe you have to say something.
I think we're
very last
yeah, we're
question.
short of time, but we have one more.
Можно? Я прошу прощения, что я возвращаю вот этого серьезного разговора к конкретным вопросам, очень коротким. И, ну, частично он уже прозвучал сегодня, но в более сложном варианте. Почему же вы выбрали все-таки для двух основных произведений зала социалистического реализма? И какое искусство окружало в других городах и странах произведение «Это пропаганда»? Это вопрос, который будут задавать все зрители, и задают многие сотрудники Третьяковской галереи.
I mean, when Sarah asked the question, you know, they call you the sunshine here, so you know, I feel tempted to answer to the sunshine because, yeah. But I actually already said when Sarah asked the same question that I think that I am very happy with the placement, and I was saying, I think to Teresa yesterday, you know, like when I was rehearsing there, like each time I looked up from like focusing on the dancers, I had a new interpretation, and I think that's the fun of the game. And I'm not sure it's so important in this game what I think, you know, and I wouldn't want to kind of narrow the game by giving my personal view. And also I don't have one personal view. Like I say, it was like I was saying to Teresa, it never happened to me before that like each time I looked up I had a new idea of what the relation between the two is, you know. But I definitely had a very strong feeling that it had to be there. Sorry, it's not very interesting answer, but it's the best I can give right now.
It really depends on us how to interpret it. I think we are short of time actually,
Yeah,
and also I also need to say thank you, Tino. Thank you, Francesco. It was it's really an honor to have both of you here, and it's, I would say, a historical moment that you're two talking together at the Tretjikov Gallery. So I also want to say big thanks to everyone who contributed to making this happen at the foundation with our partners, to all of the interpreters who are participating in the work and who are just starting to work and going to be doing this for another 6 weeks. So thank you so much, and I think now we can just go and chat in the garden, and maybe more questions will come up.
Yes, Vika, Victoria, sorry.
Thank you.